Welcome back, everyone. We have a great segment in store. So first off, we're going to be talking about how China admitted it was working to interfere in the U.S. elections. We're going to be looking as well into Beijing entering what they call a wartime state as the new virus is spreading there. And also China's Three Gorges Dam is being threatened by floods, and this could put millions of lives at risk. Now, before we get started, we have launched a Patreon. As we mentioned before, YouTube is now censoring us. Many of our videos are getting demonetized. We've also seen huge drops in traffic. So if you folks want to show your support, please look for our Patreon link in the description below. Also, quick note from my editor, we're new to Patreon, we only launched it a few days ago, and so we actually forgot to post the videos on the last two ones, so I really apologize for that. Going forward, we shouldn't have issues like this. Again, really apologize for that. We're going to be broadcasting these videos a few hours earlier. We're doing 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time for Patreon. And also every Sunday, we're going to be doing a live Q&A for some of our Patreon subscribers. Now let's jump into the segment for today. So first up, China has admitted previously that it was working to interfere in the U.S. elections. They had public reporting on this. In fact, many Western media, including in the U.S., were reporting on it and seem to have forgotten about it. This is important now because it contradicts what Bolton is now saying about Trump. Now let me explain. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton is claiming in an upcoming book that's being challenged now that President Donald Trump asked Chinese leader Xi Jinping for help winning the 2020 election. And Bolton's account is now being disputed by U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who was at that meeting. Now, Lighthizer said at a Senate Finance Committee hearing, the claims are absolutely untrue. Never happened. I was there. I have no recollection of that ever happening. I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it ever happened. The Washington Post ran an excerpt of the book claiming that during a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Xi at the Group of 20 summit in Japan in June 2019, Trump turned to conversation, as Bolton wrote, to, quote, China's economic capability to affect the ongoing campaigns, pleading with Xi to ensure he'd win. Bolton continued, quote, he stressed the importance of farmers and increased Chinese purchases of soybeans and wheat in the electoral outcome. Now he continued, quote, I would print Trump's exact words, but the government's pre-publication review process has decided otherwise. Now let me explain what really happened, based on what we know on surface reporting. Bolton's characterization of this meeting is unlikely, even based on public reports at that time. The context of this is important. Now at the time, 2018, 2019, let's explain what was happening. At the time, China was accused of trying to interfere in the 2020 elections, the presidential elections in the U.S., by placing sanctions on U.S. farmers to turn the American heartland against Trump's harsh trade policies against China. In other words, China wasn't trying to help Trump win the elections. China was trying to block Trump from winning re-election. Now, the context of soybeans is important in this. Let me explain. In 2018, China put a 25% tariff on U.S. soy imports and was accused of sanctioning its private sector from buying U.S. soybeans. That was in response to Trump's strong stance against China, not the supportive stance for China that Bolton characterizes. And the move was interpreted by many news outlets and analysts of China trying to help the Democrats, not Trump, win the 2020 elections. Let me give a few quotes on this. Forbes reported in August 2019 that China wanted Trump to lose the 2020 elections, and the actions against soy imports was part of this strategy. The United States is the biggest soy exporter in the world, and China was the largest buyer. Forbes wrote that in 2018, quote, the Chinese did a full stop of purchases of American soy and pork in hopes of influencing the midterm congressional elections in November. The strategy to maximize economic pain and fear in farm counties ultimately helped flip red counties blue. The Democrats won in a landslide, a victory China hopes gets repeated next November. Forbes also wrote that, quote, assuming China is going to use that strategy again, American farmers will have to find new markets. Maybe the meatless movement will do them some good. Beyond meat, there will be more soy farmer desperation because their old go-to market has gone cold. Now, the Washington Post, which republished the claim by Bolton just recently, actually wrote back in September 2018, quote, "As the trade war between Washington and Beijing escalates, China is using economic leverage to exert pressure on the U.S. political system. Tactics already deployed include pressuring U.S. companies trying to do business with China and punishing U.S. exporters, especially in locations where President Trump's political base resides." And they continue, quote, "Trump, taking this activity personally, tweeted this week that China is, quote, actively trying to impact and change our election by attacking our farmers, ranchers, and industry workers because of their loyalty to me." Trump's tweet at that time read, quote, "China has openly stated they are actively trying to impact and change our election by attacking our farmers, ranchers, and industrial workers because of their loyalty to me." So very different from what Bolton is saying. Let's continue. Los Angeles Times reported in September 2018 that, quote, "President Trump unexpectedly used a high-level United Nations meeting on non-proliferation Wednesday to accuse China of seeking to meddle in the November midterm election in retaliation for the worsening U.S. trade war with Beijing." It continues, quote, "In a phone briefing for reporters, a senior administration official said the Chinese effort has, quote, reached an unacceptable level, but made clear it did not involve hacked emails and phony social media posts, as Russia's operation did in 2016. It says, in the trade war, China has specifically aimed tariffs at soybean farmers who support Trump, the official said. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans, again, and prices for U.S. farmers have fallen sharply this year because of the tariffs and a record harvest." Now, continuing on this, China was being accused of trying to interfere in the U.S. elections. The CCP openly stated it, and many news outlets such as Forbes noted that China's actions against farmers did impact the elections in the midterms by flipping votes in favor of the Democrats. Again, not for Trump. The Global Times, one of the main Chinese state-run news outlets, wrote even recently that China is specifically targeting Republicans who have been groundlessly accusing China and inflaming the holding China accountable political farce will face severe consequences, sources said, noting that the aftermath will also impact the upcoming November elections, while business and trade between Missouri and China will be further soured. Global Times stated, quote, "For some U.S. states, China's sanctions might have a direct impact on the upcoming elections in November if local Republicans have been targeted by the Chinese government for their groundless accusations against Beijing and the endless attacks that put China-U.S. relations in a danger." Now again, this is Global Times, one of the main mouthpieces of the Chinese Communist Party, openly stating, threatening U.S. Republicans, that if they continue to criticize the CCP, they're threatening to interfere in the elections using soybeans, using agriculture, using these things to impact the November elections in the United States. Now, Global Times continues, quote, "For instance, China is the third largest export destination for Missouri after the UK and Canada for goods and services in 2019 worth $1.1 billion and $775 million, respectively. Some of the top goods exported to China include oilseeds and grains, meat products, and medicine. They say China could impose countermeasures on the relevant states represented by those anti-China lawmakers, including measures targeting trade and exchanges. The CCP is openly threatening Republicans, saying that it can use sanctions on agriculture to interfere with the U.S. elections. And again, it's Republicans they're targeting. So going by Trump's words at the time, public news reports at the time, and even from direct admissions of the CCP, Trump's statements on the Chinese regime around ending sanctions on soybeans and agricultural products were not to ask China to interfere in the 2020 elections. They were to stop the CCP from interfering in U.S. elections, which they were and still are doing by their own admission. Now let's move on to the next story. Beijing has entered a, quote, wartime state as a new virus wave spreads. On June 18th, Xu Hujian, a deputy minister of the Beijing Municipal Party Committee Propaganda Department, said at a press conference that since the cluster epidemic occurred on the new wholesale market on June 11th, that's in Beijing, 158 cases of new coronavirus have been diagnosed in Beijing. The current epidemic situation in the capital is grim and complex. Prevention and control are at a critical juncture. The city has launched a second-level emergency response level. The epidemic prevention and control work has once again entered a wartime state. Now let's continue. China's Three Gorges Dam is being threatened by the floods. You might remember in the last video we mentioned these floods throughout southern China, and this is the biggest flood they've had since 1949. It's hit 24 provinces and cities in South China. And there are concerns that this flood is going to impact the Three Gorges Dam. Now let's go into this a bit more. It was widely reported in 2019 that the Three Gorges Dam appeared distorted and in an elastic state. Again, satellite images show this. You can see in one image when it was early on that the dam looked very normal. It looked very straight, very sturdy. And then more recent satellite images show that it's bending in multiple places. The Chinese Communist Party excused those rumors and said the dam had moved a few millimeters from changes in temperature and water level. Now when it comes to the significance of that dam, if that dam were to break, there are different estimates on what that would mean. Some put the death toll in hundreds of millions in China. Hundreds of millions potential dead if that dam breaks. We saw structural weakness last year in it. The CCP wrote it off. And with these floods now, there are concerns that it will break. People are warning about it. They're very concerned about it. It's also one of the Chinese regime's main hubs for electricity. And so the amount of damage it could cause, not just to loss of life, not just to infrastructure, not just to cities in its wake, but also long-term to the Chinese economy and to Chinese basic infrastructure when facing, possibly, a new outbreak of this virus. Now moving on, you may remember these different reports we had talking about countries and different cities in the US buying Chinese medical equipment and finding that equipment was unusable. Now one of these companies is now facing charges in the United States for exporting defective and misbranded masks that were falsely claimed to be KN95 respirators. Now read a couple quotes from this Department of Justice report. They say, quote, "A Chinese manufacturer was charged today with producing and exporting to the United States in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic over 140,000 misbranded and defective masks that falsely purported to be KN95 respirators." Now the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey is saying, quote, "Defective and misbranded personal protective equipment is a danger to all who unwittingly purchase and use it." Now, a few notes on this. This was a global problem. Chinese companies selling defective gear. And it's one thing to request a refund. It's another thing to press charges against these Chinese companies for doing it. And if the United States is going to start pressing charges against Chinese companies for doing that, many countries around the world, any country that imported these products that were defective, they could follow suit and also press charges if they want to. Now an update on this border conflict between India and China. The Indian Army has given emergency powers to combat Chinese aggression. India TV reported, quote, "Indian Army has been given emergency powers to deal with complete freedom against any Chinese aggression at the line of actual control, LAC. The decision has been taken by the government in the aftermath of a violent clash that took place on Monday night, which resulted in the martyrdom of 20 Indian soldiers, including a colonel rank officer. The government has reportedly given Indian Army a free hand to act as they see fit in the Galwan Valley region where the clashes took place." Now, a few notes on this. The fight between India and China, these different forces on both sides of the borders, allegedly was fought with fists and with medieval mace-like iron poles with nails in them. Many deaths were allegedly from soldiers falling off of a cliff. New details are coming out on this now. Now for India, this is serious though. If they don't hold their ground at that border, and if they don't push back, the CCP will likely roll in and seize the territory. This happened to India already in 1962, and India very likely remembers this. For them, this is an issue of, do they hold their ground, do they take a strong stance, or do they back off and let the CCP seize that territory, which they will based on past experiences. Now in other news, moving to Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party is reviewing its national security laws over Hong Kong. Now this move followed a 7-hour talk between Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and with Yang Jiechi, member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China and director of the Office of Foreign Affairs Work Committee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. Now, the official's Chinese state-run news agency Xinhua reported that the 19th meeting of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of China will today review the draft Hong Kong version of the national security law, which includes prevention, suppression, and punishment of 4 types of criminal acts that occurred in Hong Kong's split country. This is them saying that. And the corresponding criminal responsibilities are clearly stipulated, according to them. Now, G7 also is coming out. Foreign ministers with the G7 are issuing a statement urging Beijing to abandon Hong Kong version of the national security law. So Beijing is seeing pressure from 2 directions now, very likely from Pompeo and very likely from G7 now, to roll back its plans to implement these national security laws that will effectively end Hong Kong autonomy. Now, a few other news stories. Brain damage is being found in 20% of people who died from the coronavirus. Now, we have a report here saying that a neuroimaging study showed brain damage in 20% of patients who died from coronavirus. And this is according to reporting from the Erasmus Hospital. Now, researchers there used MRI to observe the brains of patients who died as a result of the virus. And that was their finding. Also, Americans reportedly find a loophole to violate Canada's COVID-19 border closure. You might remember a recent report saying that Canada has again chosen to close the borders. Officials in Canada are investigating U.S. citizens crossing the border on pretext of visiting Alaska, only to stay in Canada. They say the frontiers remain closed since March 21st, but U.S. citizens without coronavirus symptoms are still allowed to enter Canada in order to reach the U.S. state of Alaska. Such travelers are required to use drive-through windows for food and pay for gas at the pump, and must undergo quarantine if they use a hotel. And it seems they're using that as their loophole to go there and stay there. Now, also a report from Texas, coronavirus hospitalizations have allegedly surged 11% in a single day. This ties into the bigger picture across the United States. Questions of whether these mass protests that we recently had will lead to more virus outbreaks. It's unclear if that will happen. The incubation period of this virus is estimated to be about 2 weeks. So really this weekend we should start seeing whether or not these virus lockdowns were necessary, because if they were necessary, we're going to see large outbreaks from these protests very likely. And on that note, Trump is saying the U.S. will not lock down again amid rising COVID-19 cases. And that said, folks, again, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you next time.